welcome to Lupus Forum's review of EULAR 2023. In this podcast, we're going to be covering some of the key lupus content from the Congress in more detail. There was an awful lot to take in, so whether you're able to attend or not, this is a good opportunity to catch up on anything you've missed. And it's my pleasure to be sharing this review with Vibeke Strand, who's an adjunct clinical professor in the Division of Immunology and Rheumatology at the Stanford University School of Medicine in the USA. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Nice to be here. And this has been a good EULAR meeting. I think there's been a lot of good information, particularly in lupus.
Yeah. What were your highlights?
Well, we keep hearing about the CAR T cell work, but it stays more and more interesting, and I think it's getting enthusiastically addressed. I think that the upadacitinib with elsubrutinib combination is interesting, although it appears that it's mostly going to be upadacitinib that's the effective part of the product, which is very interesting. And then telitacicept was interesting to me.
I agree, and so we picked all of those out as highlights. And as I always say when I come back from these conferences, it's great to meet everyone and have some face-to-face contact with your colleagues. So let's go on to the first abstracts, I think. So first, there's always quite a lot of information about glucocorticoids in the field of lupus, and we're more and more mindful of the need to minimize them. So we picked out one abstract on that theme, which is this French study led by Laurent Arnaud. So this was a nationwide study of glucocorticoid use. So we see quite a lot of studies where we try and describe glucocorticoid use, how many patients get excessive doses, what are the consequences of that. A lot of those are done in specific cohorts, maybe in cohorts who are specialist centers. And of course, those may include perhaps they're more severe patients because they're tertiary referral centers, or perhaps they're good at limiting their steroids because they've got access to a lot of other therapies. So I think the nice thing here was this was a really nationwide cohort from a French health insurance claims database. So it's the first time we've got a nationwide study, and what they've shown is that overall 48.2% of lupus patients, so almost half of lupus patients, were receiving glucocorticoids. Of those, 35.7% were a dose less than 5 milligrams, whereas 6.1% were a dose of greater than 7.5 milligrams a day, which is the kind of level where we normally think is unacceptable. There were a few associations with the glucocorticoid use. So there was more if there were higher doses in patients who were in this universal healthcare program in France, and there were more if patients had specific organ manifestations. A lot of them are manifestations of more severe disease like kidney involvement, skin, pleuropericardial disease, thrombocytopenia. The patients who were getting more than 5 milligrams were getting more complications, consistent with what you'd expect. And I know sometimes it's hard to tell whether those complications are due to the lupus or due to the steroids or due to something else, but actually a lot of those really sound like they're directly due to the steroids. And patients who were receiving larger doses were more likely to be on other lupus therapies, not non-steroid treatments like immunosuppressants. So you can see the attempts there to use other drugs to limit glucocorticoid use, but also still some work to go to get that down in more patients. What did you think of that one?
I thought it was interesting as well. I was a bit surprised that they were actually down to only about half of the patients being treated with steroids, because we seem to be having a very hard time getting people to use less steroids or even no steroids. And so this was an interesting study from that point of view.
I mean, I thought the number who were having more than 7.5 milligrams a day was actually lower than I thought it might have been, at 6.1%. I guess one of the other things that might explain it, there are modern healthcare systems. They've got access to a lot of other therapies, maybe. Of course, the other thing is, the demographics of the population will determine how much steroids are used, with European ancestry patients generally having milder disease. So the next section, we had some abstracts on new data on established therapeutic approaches, didn't we? And you've taken a look at the first one of those, haven't you, with this paper on belimumab?
Yeah, so this is predictors of renal flares from 4 of their phase 3 trials, the BLISS 52, 76, NEA or Northeast Asia, and BLISS SC. And this is one of the series of analyses that Yanni Paradis has done. He's at the Karolinska, and I think he's been allowed to sort of play with the belimumab database, and he's come up with a lot of interesting analyses. So this was post hoc, looking for risk factors for renal flares. And this is a question because, of course, there's always been the idea that maybe some people are still going to get renal disease while they're on belimumab. And although it's a good treatment and accepted treatment for nephritis, and then whether they had developed the renal disease before they started the belimumab or they developed it during belimumab. At any rate, what he found were, of course, the best predictor of renal flares was a current or former renal involvement at baseline, and that was a hazard ratio of 9.4, statistically significant. Baseline low serum albumin, as we might expect, increased proteinuria with a higher hazard ratio of 1.3 versus 0.9, and then, of course, low C3 levels, 1.8 hazard ratio. What was also interesting is that the antibody profile differed between the placebo group, where positive anti-SM antibodies were considered a risk factor, hazard ratio of 2.9, whereas in the belimumab groups, it was anti-RNP and anti-cardiolipin with hazard ratios of 2.8 and 1.8. So this is very interesting, and perhaps we can use this as another way of predicting renal flares, which would be very helpful as we are following our patients longer and longer on some of the same therapies.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some people who've reported case reports here and there of patients who went on belimumab for another reason and then got a lupus nephritis flare, which, I think has raised the question of whether, is that because somehow the belimumab shifts the changes the lupus in some way, that it goes to another organ? Or is it just that obviously they started belimumab because they had active lupus and their lupus just went on flaring for a while? I think these data, and that's what I was thinking about, and I think these data would suggest it's the latter, really, isn't it? If you're at risk of renal flares anyway, those are the people who get them. It's not the people who you would never expect to have renal involvement, is it? Right. The other thing I noticed when they were presenting it was they said it. I think they said it was 192 flares in over 3,000 patients, so 6%, something like that. So
not an extensive number of flares. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good point.
So then some additional data here from phase 2 and phase 3 studies, and the first one is one that I've presented. So this was a study that I've been doing for quite a few years now, and it's a small trial. So it's a feasibility trial, although it is randomized. And the idea was here to try and solve some of the issues to do with lupus trials, and particularly as that related to rituximab, because, when rituximab, the first biologic to be tried in lupus, everyone thought it would work. And I think a lot of people were quite shocked by the results when the trials were all negative, and it's never really been properly addressed, exactly how to measure that. But also then, obviously, since then, there's been lots of other biologics, I think, where we've had trials that were negative, but a feeling that maybe that answer is wrong and the drug really did work, maybe for various reasons, but sometimes you've got two trials that disagree with each other. So you think it must not be right. So the idea here was to try a different design that had a few different features to try and measure response more accurately. So first thing is, it's all about lupus arthritis, one of the most common manifestations. And then what that has some advantages, because if it's all about arthritis, you can scan all the patients with ultrasound at the start to make sure they've got active disease, which should help. You can also maybe have some more stricter standard of care, so they couldn't go over 10 milligrams of prednisolone at baseline and no more than 25% increases through the study. And there are outcome measures that might be more customized to the joints, like joint counts, or like a tool we developed called the Lambda. It's kind of provisional, but it's like a DAS28 for lupus arthritis, with like a composite of visual analog scores and joint counts, etc. So that was the idea of the study. And in terms of the feasibility, it looked good. So, we screened patients in quite well. The patients we screened, large numbers of them went on to get randomized, and most of them completed all their assessments and completed the activity scores and things accurately. There was another feature, was that there was this rescue arm. If you got to 16 weeks to the primary endpoint and you weren't good, you could be unblinded and have rituximab if you'd been on placebo. The slightly surprising part came when we looked at, of course this is like 30 patients, so you can't really measure the efficacy very well, but of course we wanted to have a look, and we had a look at it. And the surprising part, when we looked at this kind of preliminary evidence, the efficacy, was that actually in the early time points, as in 4 weeks and 8 weeks, the patients who were on placebo, and that of course, the rituximab arm got methylpred 100 and rituximab, and the placebo just got the methylpred 100 and placebo. So there's a bit of steroid on the placebo arm, but the patients who are on the placebo arm are actually doing better than the rituximab arm at 4 weeks and 8 weeks. It's very surprising. But then as it got to 16 weeks, they kind of came back together again. So it sort of seemed like actually in the short term, rituximab are a bit worse, which is a bit weird. But then when we looked across all the cycles given, all the open label, all the rescue therapy, everything, there was good improvement with rituximab at 0 to 16. And that was backed up by ultrasound improvement as well. So it's a bit of a complicated message. And I spent a long time thinking about it. And I was actually still thinking about it the day before I gave the presentation. And I made an extra slide to try and explain what I thought, which was kind of that maybe in the short term, you can have little flares if you have rituximab. The cell killing, you're disrupting a finely balanced immune system. There may be some regulatory effects of B cells as well. We've previously seen minor skin flares in people who went on to do very well. So maybe early on you get little flares, but then later on you get all the benefits in terms of autoantibodies coming down.
Sure.
Yeah, so sure. A strange result, but I think it does tell us more about exactly how to do trials, more importantly, going forwards.
That makes a great deal of sense.
So then we had another two trials on these a couple of those interesting mechanisms you mentioned,
right?
Didn't we?
So this one was ABBV-599, but also upadacitinib monotherapy. So they started the study with 2 groups of the combination of the BTK inhibitor, elsabrutinib and UPA. It was a high dose, which you see here, and the lower dose, which was 30 and 15. And that group, as well as the UPA monotherapy 15 milligram, were stopped after they did an interim analysis for lack of efficacy. And they continued the high dose combo and the high dose UPA. And what we basically see here is that very similar results between the combo and UPA itself, and really leads us to believe that probably upadacitinib is actually responsible for the majority of the efficacy. So this was non-overlapping signaling pathways, since we're looking at BTK versus basically JAK1, little bit of JAK2. Yeah. This was SLEEK, a phase 2 randomized placebo-controlled trial. And in the end, after the interim, there were 205 patients left. And essentially the primary endpoint was SRI-4 with a steroid dose of less than or equal to 10 QD at week 24. And that was 48.5% of those in the high dose combo group and 43.5% in the upadacitinib group, 30 milligrams. The combo was statistically significant. But the key secondary endpoints showed statistic benefit with both the combo and with UPA, as per the BICLA, which was again about 48.5 with the combo, and higher with UPA 30, 53.2, versus a placebo response of 25%. So that was a nice differentiation. LL-DAS 39.7 and 50% with UPA, again with about a 24% placebo effect. And the overall flares and the time to the first flare were substantially reduced in both treatment groups. They had such few flares that they had to combine the flare analysis as opposed to just looking at severe flares, of which there were just a couple. And what we've seen from another abstract that was presented was that upadacitinib is modulating the type 1 interferon signal, and that appears to be the main biomarker of effects driven by both the combo and the singular. And so they are going to continue further analyses and trials with upadacitinib 30 milligrams in lupus.
Seems like it's the upadacitinib that's doing all the work and the BTK
right.
not doing very much.
Right.
Is that right?
Right.
Which is, it's because we had some BTK inhibitor trials a year or two
right.
ago, and they were all pretty flat as well, weren't they?
They were.
You think they should work, those drugs, but several trials now saying the BTK part doesn't have anything to offer.
No, it's very interesting. The BTKs just haven't been that effective, impressively effective in lupus for some reason. The next one is about ianalumab, and I know Novartis has a lot of enthusiasm about this product. It's essentially an anti-BAFF receptor monoclonal antibody, and so it's mostly enhancing B cell depletion, but then it's also decreasing B cell differentiation, proliferation, and survival with its BAFF effects as well. And so they were looking at ianalumab in 28-week multi-center randomized parallel group double-blind phase 2 trial. And this is essentially an interim analysis. Monthly injections of ianalumab, 300 milligrams or placebo. They were looking at outcomes on a monthly basis as well. And their primary outcome was the SRI-4, and either prednisolone dose tapered to less than or equal to 5 a day, or to less than or equal to baseline by week 16, and then maintained to week 28. So the interim analysis at week 28 in a small number of patients, this is 34 patients on ianalumab and 33 on placebo, already we see a primary outcome in 44% of the patients who received ianalumab versus 9% of placebo. That's a nice differentiation. Then 70.6% of the ianalumab and versus 24% of the placebo patients achieved an SRI-4. So there was, again, some consistency, although we always know that those patients who are SRI-4 responders are not necessarily BICLA responders and vice versa. And then the incidence of moderate to severe flares were lower in the ianalumab group, 44% versus 64% with placebo, which makes you wonder about this patient population. They must have had fairly active disease. And again, the patients receiving ianalumab up to 28 weeks in this interim analysis were more likely to achieve LL-DAS, lupus low disease activity score, than placebo. So ianalumab was well tolerated and has efficacy despite the small numbers included in this interim analysis. So it should be interesting to see what the final data show.
Yeah, and that's another one that's gone into phase 3 at the moment, isn't it? I know they're setting up those studies at the moment, but just like the next abstract we're going to look at, actually, it's these deltas in these lupus trials are getting bigger, aren't they?
Yes,
they were
yes,
a few
they
years
are.
ago, and you don't know is that because the drugs are getting better, or is it because we're getting better at doing the trials? You don't know, but it seems like
Or as we Or we're getting better at selecting the patient population.
And that is a perfect segue into the next abstract, actually, because this was the telitacicept trial that Ronald van Vollenhoven presented. So we've seen a few abstracts on this at conferences in the last year or so. And so this is where you need to think about your BAF biology a bit, really, which is that we know BAF or BLIS is this survival molecule for B cells that they essentially the BAF receptor, which is also the target of the ianalumab we were just talking about. But as B cells get a bit later on through their development, and memory B cells and plasmablasts and plasma cells, they start expressing different receptors called TACI and BCMA, and those respond to an analogous molecule, not BAF, but actually one called APRIL. So there's always been this question about whether belimumab, by just knocking out BAF, is not really inhibiting that whole system enough, that you've still got APRIL signaling going on, and that particularly works on maybe those sort of mature, more developed B cells that maybe are more important. So I think that's the concept here, is that telitacicept is a fusion protein of this TACI receptor. There's a receptor that binds both BAF and APRIL, so it should be more comprehensive blockade of the system. And it's already been approved in China in 2021. But here's a phase 3 randomized controlled trial where the patients got telitacicept 160 milligrams or placebo, which is given sub-Q, or placebo over a period of 52 weeks. Again, primary endpoint SRI-4 at week 52, like a lot of other studies. But the real eye-catching thing here is that the response rates for telitacicept was 82.6% compared to 38.1% for placebo. So a really big delta there, and backed up again by the Selena-SLEDAI scores and the PGA scores,
yes,
flare reductions. And so it's exactly what we were just saying, isn't it? It's like, that seems great, a much higher degree of efficacy, but is that because it's such a radically difficult mechanism of action, or is it something about this population of patients were more active, more responsive, trial conduct was different or more robust?
Yeah, it's one of the questions we have since the study was done in China. The product is approved in China, and we have trouble in the US because FDA wants data from US patients, and they have a lot of trouble with the Chinese data because they say they don't get the details that they want about the information of the patients and so on. But this is the second big study with telitacicept that's successful. Now, there's another company, Alpine, that's making another BLIS-APRIL dual inhibitor, which they believe is even more specific for APRIL, more effective against APRIL. And it'll be interesting to see Alpine 303, how it does. There was an early study here in the abstract section, which showed that it had effects in normal volunteers. So should be interesting in lupus.
I mean, I think some of these differences between different demographic populations of people are genuinely, quite real things. And if you, of course, prevalence of lupus is high in China, and often the disease is more severe. So that may make it quite different in effect of drugs.
Yeah. Well, we also know lupus is different in Asians as well as, when we look across the US studies and we see Black Americans and we see Asian Americans and then we see Hispanic Americans, and they're all very different from the Caucasians that we've treated as well. So I think there's a lot to be said for the heterogeneity of lupus populations everywhere.
So then we're on to some of the more novel therapies now, aren't we?
Yes. And I'm glad you get to do this one, although I'm very excited about it as well.
I think everyone's very interested, aren't they? So this, so CAR T therapy. So this is based on targeting B cells and depleting B cells. But I think we've known for a long time that one reason why rituximab as the first drug didn't work so well as always, was because it didn't kill B cells profoundly enough. So you can still see B cells in the circulation after rituximab, and there's probably even more of them in tissue. And I think that is a general story that's maintained with the monoclonal antibodies, is that you need to give enough drug to kill B cells properly, and the later generation depleters like ianalumab we talked about, or obinutuzumab, those are kind of glyco-engineered to kill B cells more efficiently. But what they've been up to in oncology is, instead of using a monoclonal antibody to kill the B cell, they've been using these sort of reprogrammed T cells, so chimeric antigen receptor T cells. So they take the patient's own T cells, they sort of reprogram the T cell receptors, they target CD19 and a B cell marker, and then give them back to the patient so that the T cells are killing B cells. That has to be done. It has to be said that's not a straightforward thing to do. So it has to be given as part of a conditioning regime that involves a lot of other cytotoxic drugs, and that may, of course, have impacts on how this works, those other drugs. And it's also quite a heavy thing for the patient to go through. But they published this case series last year of 5 patients who had CAR T therapy, and they were commenting that the patients had got quite good remissions lasting up to 18 months and had come off their other therapies. So arguing that by depleting B cells more efficiently, they'd reset the disease in a more fundamental way than is achieved with monoclonal antibodies. Now, to me at the time, I was kind of thinking, I thought to myself, I remember back in 2002, when David Eisenberg published his case series of rituximab, he said, I've got 5 patients, I've depleted their B cells, I've got 18-month remissions. They've gone almost the exact same thing. So that was my, the first thing I thought is, great, good, that is an interesting advance, that there may be another, this may do the job better than monoclonals, but I kind of need to see more long-lasting data to really convince me that this is something different than what you can do with monoclonals. So this is that. So they followed up their abstract, but they followed up their paper that was published last year with a bit longer term follow-up. And they have 7 patients, and the follow-up's a bit longer. One of the patients, I think, had a minor renal flare and had a short course of steroids, but otherwise that message seemed to be true. But I still personally feel a little bit like I'm not totally convinced that what I'm seeing is
You're not, huh?
I know, I'm one of the skeptics. Are you?
Well, they did a renal biopsy in that patient. Yeah. And they found minimal change disease. That's true. So essentially it wasn't even lupus.
Yeah.
And there are new companies in the US now planning to do CAR T cell therapies and have started. And in fact, the FDA has actually given 2 of these companies fast track designation for their CD19 CAR T cell products. One is called Cabaletta, and it's CABA 201. And the other one's called Kyverna, and it's KYV 101. So I was actually quite pleasantly surprised that FDA has that much enthusiasm for this type of product. And remember, no one's doing controlled trials. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting point, and you should remain skeptical, although I think the data is getting better and better as it's getting longer term. The other point is, well, it's only really probably going to be practical if it becomes allogeneic. And there, if this is really true of what Georg says, then it's a single administration. And that might actually give us something that is actually practical and maybe even affordable if it can be done on an allogeneic basis.
Yeah.
Ultimately, not now.
I think I don't mean to, I'm not that skeptical. I'm not saying I don't believe it. I'm just saying you need a bit more evidence to say that it's doing something different. Right. And the question I asked in the session was, the other reason why I have my reservations about this is that in the concept being put forward here, this is like you can cure lupus if you hit B cells hard enough, is like saying the reason lupus arose is because B cells made a mistake, and it happened, and that mistake happened by accident and will only happen once. So in other words, if we correct what the B cells have done wrong, it won't happen again, and everything else will fall away. And I think those, I'm not, that may be true for some patients, but I don't think it's true for them all. Because, for example, if you look at the genetics of lupus, it's substantial, and most of the genes are in B cells. They're either in like interferon pathways, innate pathways, or aren't even in the immune system. So they take like set of genes like TREX1, the gene that's like the most penetrant gene that can give you a lupus syndrome. It's not even in the immune system, it's DNA. So it's like, I'm not completely sure that the entire problem is in B cells. Now, it might be for some people.
No.
But it might not be for them.
I agree. I agree.
And I think the other thing is, of course, if one-off treatment gives you a really, really long-lasting remission, then this is really worth it. But if you're going to keep relapsing, you actually might want monoclonal antibodies.
Then it's a problem.
Then you might want monoclonal antibodies instead. So I think it's absolutely fascinating development. But
we have obinutuzumab to look forward to as well. So you're right. Well, maybe we should move on to the efavirenz.
Okay, yes. So,
although I think we could talk about this for several hours.
Yeah.
Okay, so this was from Amgen, and it's efavirenz alpha, which is an IL-2 mutein. And essentially, they were administering it with the idea that it would not only increase Tregs, but also would maybe correct some of the defects in the Tregs because of the expansion of the population. And so they looked at functional phenotypes of Tregs between lupus patients and healthy controls, and CD25 levels were used to measure the IL-2 signaling, as we well know, and that is what's promoting the Treg expression. And so, of course, the CD25 expression levels were much lower in the lupus patients compared to the healthy patients. And this was negatively correlated with FOXP3 positive Treg and anti-double-stranded DNA antibodies. At day 22, the expression of CD25 had significantly increased and actually was comparable now to healthies, indicating that the Treg population had been expanded, and that the number of Tregs in the lupus patients were inversely correlated with their anti-double-stranded DNA antibodies at baseline. And so what we saw was a peak increase, 53.8-fold above baseline with the IL-2 mutein. And very interestingly, the intensity of the CD25 on the conventional T cells, the CD4 positive conventional T cells, wasn't significantly different between healthies and SLE, and therefore really said that it's the Treg population that is defective and is also decreased in lupus and bears increasing and otherwise stimulation for better expression. Now, this is interesting, but we already know that one of these IL-2 therapies that was started by Nektar and also licensed by Lilly has failed in lupus. And although some of this work is going on in other diseases, this may not be the most effective way of trying to increase the Treg population in lupus. What do you think, Ed?
Yeah, that's right, isn't it? We've seen a few reports. There were some academic reports of case studies, and then there were, like you say, there were other trials, and you can restore the Tregs, but it's been really hard to show a clinical benefit of that, hasn't it? And I don't know if any of these drugs is really ever going to make it to the market, even though it's an intriguing idea. I mean, it's intriguing because you're not totally immunosuppressing someone, are you? You're trying to restore tolerance, which sounds great, but yeah, I think I don't know if we'll see this in the end. And then lastly, another one I've looked at, it's an intriguing mechanism of action. which is this drug called zetomipzomib, which is an inhibitor of the immunoproteasome. So proteasomes are these things in cells that degrade proteins that have been ubiquitinated. And so the immunoproteasome is one that has a number of immune modulating functions. So generally, if the immunoproteasome is inhibited with the zetomipzomib, then you get a whole load of different immunosuppressive effects that could be on cytokines, lymphocyte proliferation, migration, adhesion, etc. So I think the interesting thing here is that sounds like it could have many different potential indications. Lupus is one, but I know the company that developing are thinking about all sorts of other things like autoimmune hepatitis. They're looking at myositis too. So here, what we've got here actually is pretty early phase data. So it's this is a phase 2 trial and it's open label. So it's zetomipzomib in patients with active LN class 3, 4, or 5 on stable background therapy. And you've got 65% of them got a 50% reduction in the use PCR against placebo, and 35.3% got complete renal response. So okay, that sounds all right, but there's no placebo arm here, and it's just, I think it's just one to keep an eye on, isn't it? We don't know yet how promising this is going to be.
Right. I have to agree. We haven't seen a controlled trial with this product in any indication, although I hear they're doing something in dermatomyositis. And 35 years ago, we fought and fought to finally start putting placebo into autoimmune disease trials. And it's been very, very important. And it's part of the reason why the FDA guidances have always said only 12 weeks of placebo exposure, because if you limit it to 12, maybe 14 weeks, you haven't caused an irreversible loss of physical function in terms of HAQ scores, et cetera. And so that's really been our way to go forward. And so I really think they need a trial.
Yeah. And that's the end of our abstracts. So the content from EULAR will be available on demand until the 31st of December, 2023. So if you get the chance, you can look at the sessions on SLE that we've highlighted while those are available. And that just leaves me to thank Vibeke for joining me, and thank you for listening. We've got regular podcasts on the Lupus Forum discussing all the latest publications in lupus, so make sure you have a look at lupus-forum.com to keep up to date. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure working with you, Ed.
Always a pleasure.